Chapter 11. Devotion. We have thus far studied the testimony of the sages. From them we understand that the direct and immediate means of winning deliverance is the quest of the real self, by turning the mind away from the world, that is, from everything that can be objectified, towards the self in the heart. But we find that this is not easy, because in the mind there are attachment to objects, gross or subtle, and habits of thought, which are mostly latent, but spring into feverish activity one after another, and pull the mind back to the world. These are mental taints, which are called vasanas, because they have been acquired by intimate contact with objects, and linger in the mind, like the smell of the contents that linger in a pot after it is emptied. Because of these smells of things are more in some than in others, there is a great difference between one disciple and another. The sage tells us that disciples are of 4 grades, comparable to gunpowder, dry charcoal, ordinary fuel, and wet fuel. The first kind of disciple needs only a word, like a spark, to consume his ignorance at once, gunpowder. The second kind needs some teaching and personal effort. The third kind needs a long course of teaching, training, and practice. And the fourth kind needs to be made fit for discipleship itself by practices suitable to his condition. Hence, most disciples would need to persevere in the quest for a long time before they could become confident of winning ultimate success. Many might become discouraged at the want of success and be inclined to give up the enterprise. What are these disciples to do so that they may be able to make some steady progress towards the goal? The answer is they must practice devotion to God. Now we come to the testimony of the saints. We have already seen that these, as a class, are much safer guides than the yogis. What we learn from the saints is not always the pure truth, but truth in relativity. But because the way followed by the saints leads ultimately to egolessness, therefore the sages freely approve of that way, though they do not approve always of the narrowness and crudity of some of the utterances of many of the saints. It is a fact that few saints rise above sect. Sectarianism is a drag on progress. Hence, the disciples of the sage must, in following the path of devotion, discriminate between saint and saint on occasion, and become aware of entanglement in sectarian beliefs. As a disciple of the sage, he must know that beliefs are to be held tentatively, because all beliefs will one day be consumed in the fire of experience of the self. The disciple must take only what the most sage-like saints say, and leave out all the rest. And he must understand the teaching in the light of the Advaitic teaching of the sages. The sage himself gives us the essence of the teaching of the saints. He tells us that to attribute name and form to reality, and thereby adding personality to it, and making reality into what we call God, is quite proper and necessary as a means of mental purification. But the sage says also that any name and any form may be so attributed, that it is narrowness to claim that a particular form is alone holy. And he reconciles this devotion with the foregoing teaching about the quest and the egoless state, by telling us that the goal of the devotee is the same as that of the seeker. It is said of devotion in the Gita, Chapter 9, that even men of evil life are benefited by it. they become good very soon and finally reach the state of unending peace, the egoless state. But as a general rule, only men of pure mind and good conduct are drawn into devotion to God, because a certain degree of egolessness is implicit in devotion, and character is proportional to the degree of one's egolessness. Hence, one should devote some attention to the improvement of character. This, of course, is necessary for all, for seekers of the self as well as for all devotees. As a man is, so he acts. Conversely, as a man acts, so he will become in time. The human personality attains impersonality through self-regulated expression in conduct. Hence, regulation of conduct is necessary for him that aspires to the highest good. In the ancient lore, we are told that he that would find the truth must have eschewed wrongdoing, subdued his passions, and attained mental harmony. Truth and goodness are essentially the same. The sacred book known as the Gita also lays great stress on this condition. The seeker must have what it calls the godly endowment in order to reach the goal. This godly endowment includes fearlessness and clear thinking, meditativeness, readiness to give, control of mind and body, reverence of the holy, and love of truth, along with straightforwardness, non-injury, forbearance, not telling tales of gossip, compassion, freedom from greed, gentleness, shrinking from wrongdoing, and not being capricious. All of these may be summed up as good character. They are the aroma of the real self that dwells in our hearts. Therefore, they make for impersonality. To them belong the persons, not they to the persons, for goodness is not a possession. It is the possessor. Rightly do all the religions emphasize goodness. A man of bad character may become a good mathematician or scientist, but only a good and pure-minded man can cherish devotion. We saw that there are only two alternatives. Either all members of a triad are unreal or all are real. And this was illustrated by the analogy of the hen. So for one that accepts the teaching that the world and soul are unreal, the whole triad is unreal. This was the argument there. But for one that does not accept or is unable to assimilate this teaching about the world and soul, the position is quite different. The same argument and the same analogy will lead him to the conclusion that God is real as God, and hence there is scope for devotion until he loses the ego. Besides, we were not taught that God is altogether unreal, but only that in his real nature he is not God or a person, but the real self in the heart. The following utterance of the sage will make this clear when he said, "So long as there is division, there must be devotion. So long as there is separation, there must be a method of reunion. So long as there is duality, there will also be God and devotee. In the quest of the truth also there is duality till the source is reached. So also it is in devotion. When God is one, there is no more duality, nor is he different even now. For God is thought in and by the self, which proves that God is really one with the self. If one that is told to have devotion to God straight away does so without further question, it is all right. he will automatically become one with God in due course. Such a one is the ripe one. But there is another kind of man who turns round and says, there are two, God and I. Before knowing God who is far off, let me know the closer one, myself. For him, the quest is prescribed. Really, devotion and the quest are the same. On another occasion, the sage said to someone, God is as real as you are. There is therefore no real inconsistency between the truth of God as revealed by the sages, which is the absolute truth of his being, and the personality of God for the purposes of devotion. For the devotee dwells, at least in the beginning, in the region of relativity. However, because God is really the indwelling real self of the devotee, therefore he is the source of what is called grace. And this is so both for those that know that God is the real self and for those that know it not. The practical implications of grace are very important. Therefore, almost all the religions lay great stress on it. If there be no such thing as grace, then deliverance would never be possible. For the utmost efforts of finite beings can never produce an infinite result. The devotee calls it grace, while the philosopher, disciple of a sage, calls it the power of the truth that vanquishes untruth. It may be mentioned that one who, not believing in God, goes through the philosophical inquiry outlined in the foregoing chapters, and is thereby convinced that the egoless state of the sages is worth attaining, but finds that he is severely handicapped by mental discords or weaknesses, may afterwards come to accept belief in God and begin to practice devotion to him, so that through God's grace he may win the egoless state. The point is that when one thinks one is not equal to the enterprise of finding the self, it is an enormous advantage to one if one believes in God and becomes inspired with devotion to him. We shall understand this better when we study that stage of devotion which is called self-surrender. Devotion, at least to begin with, is with difference. The devotee regards God as a person, distinct from himself. For this reason, many Advaitas regard it as something beneath themselves. The sages do not approve of this. Someone put the sage the following question: I am unable to meditate on God as formless. Meditation on God with form is inferior. What am I to do? The sage of Arunachala answered, Who told you to distinguish between higher and lower methods? If you meditate on God with form as a person, that will surely take you to the goal. We know already that personality means the same as having form. So a theoretical knowledge of the truth of non-duality, far from being a bar to devotion, is actually a great aid to it. Convinced non-dualists have been sincere and ardent devotees. Great saints have had the experience of the unity of God and the self, and that has not destroyed their devotion. On the contrary, their devotion has been intensified, because whereas formerly their love was divided between two, namely their own self and God, now there remains only one, on whom all their love is lavished. Sages have composed hymns to God, as if God were a person, and these hymns are intensely devotional, though they also give expression in the hymns to the truth of unity, thereby showing that there is no practical incompatibility between that truth and devotion. In fact, the unity is in the transcendental state, while devotion is in relativity. The non-dualist gives to God the whole of his love, whereas the dualist gives him only a part. The self is the dearest of all things, as the Upanishads say, because whatever is dear to us is so for the sake of the self, not for its own sake. When the two are taken as two, then love is necessarily divided. When the two are one, the love is undivided. Hence the sage and the Gita tells us that sages are the best of devotees. In fact, the highest praise of God, the most pleasing to him, if we may say so, is not that God is the supreme Lord of all creation, but that he is the most beloved of all, as the self in the heart. The greatness of God as God is in relativity, in Maya, or illusion, but the nature of God as the self is the absolute truth, beyond Maya. The devotee that has the Advaitic faith regards God as the consumer of the ego. This is expressed by the sage in one of his hymns as follows: O men that are ready to give up the body, having lost all desire to live, there is, even here, a medicine without equal, which will surely kill the false little self without taking life, if it be meditated upon even once. That, you should understand, is the immortal Arunachala, which is the blissful real consciousness. We shall now make a detailed study of devotion as we find it in practice.